Good evening, everybody. Good to see you. This is a little loud, huh? Let's see. Alex, do you have the iPad to be able to adjust this if you need to? Okay, great. Really glad that you're here. We had pretty good RSVPs for tonight, so I'm hoping that the folks who aren't in the room are watching on the stream. I think we had about 80 people RSVP. And the nice thing about the world of virtual streaming is that it also allows us to capture this and to place it online. But we're really glad for those of you who are here this evening and really grateful that you came out to be with us for what I think will be a really meaningful and important conversation about a topic which I imagine is on kind of everybody's mind right now. But before we actually move to the conversation with Arno Rosenfeld, I want to welcome Rachel Fishman-Feddersen, who's no stranger to Beth Am Synagogue. This is really her shul, her family's shul. And I asked Rachel to come up and light the candles. We have 6 yahrzeit candles to represent the 6 million. And we're going to take a moment after Rachel has lit the candles. You can go ahead and start that to chant the memorial prayer for those. Oh, it's like it's a fancy one. There you go. I invite us to rise if we're able, please. Rachel, you may know, is the publisher of the Forward, and so the opportunity to have Arno Rosenfeld here really came about because of the relationship we had with Rachel and her family, and also in the past you've been a speaker here. We had a whole thing on press freedoms years ago during the first Trump administration, if I remember, and I think we solved all this problem, so now we can move on to other kinds of things. So I'm really grateful for you and your leadership, and thanks very much for being a part of this ceremony and the evening. So we'll offer this prayer as we begin, just to create a container as we move into Yom HaShoah, this Holocaust Remembrance Day. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Amsei Nechona Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, B'ma'alot Kedoshim Al Torim, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים לנשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל שנטבחו בשואה, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם בגן עדן דמנוחתם. Anana, Balarachamim, Hastirem, Beseter, Kenafecha Lolamim, Utzro Bitroachim et Nishmoteem, Adonai Unachalatam, Vianuchu Vishalom Amishkavoteem, Venomar, Amen. Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure to the souls of our brethren who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel who were slaughtered and suffocated and burned to ashes. May their memory endure and inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our lives. May their souls be bound up in the bond of life. May they rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. Amen. We can be seated. I'll ask Arno Rosenfeld to join me. Arno Rosenfeld is enterprise reporter at the Forward, and he's an award-winning investigative journalist. He's chronicled the Jewish American response to rising fears over anti-Semitism, covered Jewish college students confronting hostile political climates on campus. He's reported on local communities grappling with the surge of white supremacist propaganda and exposed rifts among national organizations over political issues. He's reported from Charlottesville, from Colleyville, from Tel Aviv, Berlin, Israeli-occupied West Bank, and elsewhere. We gather this evening, Arno, welcome. We're really glad that you're here. You might have to turn it on. There's like a little switch on the front. There you go.
Can you hear me? Does this work?
Perfect.
Great. Glad to be here.
So we're gathering now. Yom HaShoah exists really on the Israeli calendar, Yom HaShoah ve'Hagvura, the day that marks Holocaust and heroism. But this year, just a few months ago, we marked the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and really the beginning of the end of the war in Europe, conclusion of the Holocaust, after which time we learned that 6 million people had been killed, 6 million Jews and many others, 1.5 million children. We're now, 80 years later, in a different time, at least we hope a different time, and yet there have been some real changes happening in America. More security in synagogues, skyrocketing rates of anti-Semitism since the advent of Trump in 2015, but then also in various ways since October 7th, of course. Arno, my grandfather fled Nazi Germany after Kristallnacht, and he came here hoping to find a better situation, and he did. He found a country that was moving toward a real embrace of Jews, where there had been a history of anti-Semitism, of course, and yet Jews really found their place here. Franklin Foer wrote a kind of now infamous piece in The Atlantic recently about the end of the golden age of American Jews. And I guess my first question to you is, are things really that bad? If yes, why might that be? And if not, why does everybody think so?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here and an honor to be here on Yom HaShoah. No, I don't think they're that bad, and I did not write that piece. I think I was talking with Rabbi Dratch about David Saperstein before we started, because we both worked at the Religious Action Center, and I asked, Rabbi Saperstein he just retired after like 50 plus years at the Religious Action Center. And if you read about the history of anti-Semitism, you go back to even the 60s, there were job listings that said Gentiles only. There were very clear sort of systemic forms of discrimination still, and the 60s was later than I expected to see that. And so I asked him, at the time, were people freaked out about anti-Semitism? I mean, that's post-Holocaust. You're in the United States, you're looking for a job, or you're looking for housing, you're trying to get into a school, and you're limited by the fact that you're Jewish. Weren't people worried about that? That's so much worse objectively than anything we're dealing with today. And he said, no, because it was a clear upward trajectory. So even though things were objectively worse, the trend line was positive. And so you could say, well, yeah, my older kid had to deal with, maybe a quota or some sort of thing when they applied. But 5 years later, my daughter now has access to these things. Isn't that wonderful? And that was really the overwhelming sentiment. And now, any degree of backsliding is viewed as catastrophic, I think in part because so much of the Jewish understanding of anti-Semitism ends in, mass death and genocide. So it's very hard to see a 5% decline. Oh, maybe now we're back to the levels of anti-Semitism from the early 2000s, say, which was still a pretty good time to be a Jew in America. But we see that backsliding and we start thinking this is an existential threat to our community. So I think that's one big part of it. And I think the other part of it is every time I hear this skyrocketing rates of anti-Semitism, and the ADL yesterday came out 80% increase or something in campus anti-Semitism year over year. And they do a little chart that shows back to 2009 or something, and then boom, 2023, 2024, 2025. And it's a form of, I think, fake statistics, because they changed the formula. In 2023, they started counting things as anti-Semitic incidents that they didn't used to. You can define anti-Semitism however you like, but if you're going to make a trend line, you need to be defining it the same way each year. So for example, from the river to the sea, that slogan, if that's used at a protest, that's now an anti-Semitic incident. And so when you look at the trend lines and the percentages and all of that, it's counting almost apples and oranges. And I think it's fine to have a changing understanding of what anti-Semitism is, but I think we need to be honest about what we're actually talking about. So pack a lot in there, but I think those are some of the things going on.
So, and yet, I mean, I think it would be hard to claim that the experience of many Jews with anti-Semitism in this country now is, the same as it was in 2000. And so you pointed to some of the de jure kind of legal discrimination that existed, certainly in Baltimore. That was the case, where Jews were not allowed in certain places, not permitted. I just did a funeral today of someone who was 99 years old, who lived, her family lived right off of the Suburban Club, right? And the Suburban Club exists because Jews weren't allowed to join other country clubs. So that's true. And yet, if I were to just poll people about their own experience of being a Jew in America today, we would, I feel very certain, hear many stories about people feeling less accepted, more judged, who've had incidents themselves, things said to them, at them, sometimes violence. And so understanding that the ADL is shifting some of the ways that it understands these things, there have been trends, and you report on those trends. So what do you think that's about?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things, and there are a few interesting, I mean, the feeling, the perception of fear, which of course then manifests itself in terms of people being worried about going to Jewish events, wearing Jewish symbols, talking about being Jewish, celebrating Jewish holidays at work and at school. That is all real. So first of all, the feeling, I would say absolutely true that people are feeling more scared, and those feelings have an impact. There's a lot of interesting data, if you look at fears, concerns around campus anti-Semitism, very consistently, enormous levels of concern among people like over the age of 30, pretty consistently 80, 90% of Jews over the age of 30, campus anti-Semitism is a very serious problem. Less than 50% of Jews under 30, including the ones who are on college campuses, consider it a very serious problem. So I think, one, there is a gap between perception and firsthand experience. There's other data out there. For example, Jews in the southern United States report experiencing anti-Semitism at the highest rate of any region in the country, and report lower levels of concern than Jews in the Northeast, who report the highest levels of concern, have the lowest experience of incidents of anti-Semitism. So that's interesting. I think that what we are seeing is a sort of, you can think of it as cancel culture or alienation of Jews with an attachment to Israel, which most, at least engaged Jews in the United States, have some sort of meaningful attachment to Israel, regardless of their specific political positions. And I think for a long time that was viewed as pretty anodyne, and now it's, there are a lot of kind of litmus tests of, are you a Zionist? I was just talking with a friend in DC where I live who said that, he's single, has been going on dates, and the number of times a conversation on one of these dating apps eventually somebody will look him up, he has a distinctive enough name, they see that he's also a Jewish journalist, and they'll say, are you a Zionist? And he's like, well, how would you define Zionism? What does that mean to you? And they would say, he said, one woman said, well, you wouldn't ask how I would define, white supremacy or racism or misogyny. And that's very alienating for a lot of Jews, because whether or not, they're specifically being targeted because they're Jewish, they just feel like they can't be their authentic selves. They can't talk about this part of their identity or this part of their political, sort of a worldview. And that's really, it's been going on for a number of years, but obviously after October 7th, Israel-Hamas war, that skyrocketed. So I think that's at the root of a lot of, what we're seeing in society.
So let's talk definitions for a moment. You wrote a piece where you tried to create a Venn diagram, which I confess I didn't fully understand, but I appreciated the effort. And you used some new terminology, or at least you captured some terminology. You can speak to that terminology, or maybe just speak more broadly, but part of the challenge of talking about anti-Semitism is even understanding what we're talking about. You mentioned the ADL's kind of shifting approach to this. What's your take on anti-Semitism, and from your own reporting, what are we talking about when we talk about anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I think we're all sort of familiar with the traditional far-right anti-Semitism, which is sort of, open neo-Nazis, and also this idea that there's a Jewish cabal, and typically that's naming Jews as the enemy. And sometimes it's one step removed from naming Jews as the enemy, but you're talking about globalists and, that kind of thing, George Soros's influence, et cetera. And I think what we see on the left, which is really where the definitions are most contentious, is there's kind of the blanket view, and this is increasingly the view, certainly it's the view of the ADL, other Jewish groups I think are very similarly aligned, that anti-Zionism is de facto anti-Semitic, sort of, and what they would say, right, is if you're denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, to a nation state, that's anti-Semitic. Those definitions always sort of break down because you can find very thoughtful people who really give no indication that they're anti-Semitic and often are Jews themselves. You know, numbers vary depending on how you count it, something like 10 to 20% of American Jews probably fall into that anti-Zionist bucket, and that's not counting the large, you know, segment of Orthodox Jews who would identify that way. So then you say, okay, well, maybe you can be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic, but if you demonize Israel, that's anti-Semitic. What is demonizing Israel? If you hold Israel to a double standard, that's anti-Semitic. So there are a lot of these efforts to codify things very tightly, and I think they're almost all unworkable. At least I've never seen them ever be able to be consistently applied. I think what a lot of American Jews feel is anti-Semitic and what some of these advocacy groups view as anti-Semitic is a certain degree of vitriol, right? That you can say, look, you know, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of a nation state based on ethnicity and this idea of maintaining a Jewish majority. It's not really, that makes me uncomfortable. I'd like to see a binational state, you know, a one-state solution, everyone living in peace. And if you say it like that, and okay, you know, not anti-Semitic, but if you say, you know, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and you're not simultaneously condemning Hamas, then maybe that scans as supporting, you know, the extermination of Jews in the land of Israel. And if you're shouting that on the center of a college campus, and you're kind of sneering at the people walking by, and, you know, you're asking people if they're Zionist, and, you know, you're burning an Israeli flag, then that's anti-Semitic because almost the tenor or the tone is like liable to make Jews especially very uncomfortable. I think, you know, where I sort of come down is I think that there is a streak on the left, and we don't see a lot of explicit anti-Semitism that would sort of be universally considered anti-Semitic at these protests, for example, like people chanting about Jews. There's been a little bit of that, certainly, but that's not what most of it is. But it is that kind of thing of like, are you a Zionist? And if you are a Zionist, it doesn't matter how nuanced that is or whether it comes from, you know, your fears about another Holocaust or your family ties to Israel or your feeling of vulnerability as a minority. It doesn't matter what the reasons are. It doesn't matter how much you may or may not dislike Netanyahu. You're an evil, you're just like the Nazis. And that, I think, is sort of a failure that if you're really rigid on that, I do think that boils down to a difficulty in recognizing the sort of full humanity of American Jews and the American Jewish experience, and whether or not you have animosity toward Jews. You could even be Jewish yourself, but I think that like that the impact of that is in effect anti-Semitic if it means that like you're excluding the vast majority of American Jews from your community or milieu or whatever that may be. So that's what I find most alarming in it, whether or not it's like per se anti-Semitic.
I'm thinking a lot about, I forget who coined this phrase, but that a philo-Semite is really just an anti-Semite who loves Jews.
Yeah.
And, you know, when we talk about anti-Zionists who are engaged in anti-Semitism, offering cover maybe for certain rhetoric. I had an experience like this with a local artist who was posting some really horrible kinds of things that were definitely sort of tracking beyond just criticism of Israel or even of the war or government policies, but really, to me, felt deeply anti-Semitic. And I sort of engaged her on the question, and her response was, well, I'm just following the lead of JVP, and this is what they're saying. So there's this sense of like sort of trotting out the good Jews to justify a particular position. Of course, we see that with, you know, Elon Musk, and you're reporting about his trip to Auschwitz, and, you know, oh, well, look, Elon's not anti-Semitic because he's made this pilgrimage because, as he said, he has so many Jewish friends, right? So wherever you place yourself on the political map, there's a way that folks will kind of use their affinity for certain Jews or certain Jewish ideas in order to justify that rhetoric or that behavior. And I'm curious if you can help us unpack a little bit how you've, tried to process that in some of your reporting. Is there a through line? And I guess maybe sort of a follow-on to that is this maybe artificial distinction between anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right. Is it all that useful? Or are we actually kind of falling into a trap when we're saying, well, look what Elon does, well, look what, Israel hater X says in terms of their own justification of these things?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I always try to keep in mind because, you do, if I said 10 or 20% of Jews may fall into the anti-Zionist camp, depending on how you define it in the United States, you also have 20 to 30% of Jews that consistently vote for Republican politicians who or at least, the party has faced some of these issues, who voted for Trump, and Trump has Elon Musk in there, and Trump keeps saying things about, Jews being good at real estate and all of that. And so I think that certainly the fact that like a Jewish person believes or defends something does not excuse it. What I do find interesting though is, there are frameworks for understanding anti-Semitism and why something might be anti-Semitic. And on the right, if you get a couple orders of magnitude away from the hardcore neo-Nazis, you see a lot of rhetoric around immigrants, this idea, right, of the great replacement theory, which the argument is, it starts on the far, far right as this idea that Jews are specifically, that George Soros and a cabal of Jews are trying to get non-white immigrants into the United States to dilute the white majority or plurality of the country, to gain political power, and so on and so forth. And you see that a couple steps removed to just talking about migrant caravans, or to talk about, well, Chuck Schumer, maybe it's not Soros, but Chuck Schumer is trying to get migrants in so they can vote for the Democrats. But when it gets those couple steps removed, that's not treated by most sort of Jews and by most Jewish advocacy organizations as a form of anti-Semitism, as a watered-down form of anti-Semitism. It might be disagreeable because they disagree with the policies, but it's talked about in other terms. Whereas when you get a couple degrees removed from, you talk about sort of hardcore anti-Semitic, anti-Israel rhetoric, to just people who are like, I'm just an anti-Zionist. I think Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. I don't hate Jews. I'm not like screening Zionists out of my book club or whatever, but those are my political positions. That is treated as anti-Semitic. So I think that this idea that like, well, we see anti-Semitism on the far right and far left. Typically when people talk about the far right, they're talking about a literal Nazi salute on a stage. And on the far left, they're talking about a relatively broad category of political opinion. And so I think that is where you get into the parallel being a little disingenuous, because one is much further onto the extreme before they classify it as anti-Semitic, and the other, I think there's a lot of eagerness to call it anti-Semitic even when it's not as far, sort of equally far on the spectrum.
But doesn't it depend who's making the claim? I mean, who are the eager people you're describing?
I mean, I think that, you've seen Jonathan Greenblatt at the ADL has talked a lot about the photo inverse, right? That the far right and the far left pose the exact same degree of threat to Jews. David Harris, the American Jewish Committee for many years, talked about similarly. He often talked about the far right, the far left, and radical Islam, which is more of a concept in Europe than the United States. And Ted Deutsch, I think, is similar. Jewish Federation Network, Hillel. It's all, it's sort of this knee-jerk. Well, of course, the far right and the far left, and there's often that's not totally followed through upon. And then as a practical matter, there are many more anti-Zionists than neo-Nazis on college campuses. And so where you're actually putting your energy ends up being much more on the far left than on the far right often.
So I guess what I want to try to challenge a little bit, or maybe just push you on a little bit, is, why are we even having this debate at all? Obviously, we have to be a little careful about comparisons, right? So like anti-Semitism is its own thing, and I actually would be interested in maybe getting into the extent to which it's sort of like other bigotry or its own kind of thing. But, you hear at least somewhat analogous debates about anti-Black racism where, there are folks who will say, well, racism is the Ku Klux Klan, right? That's what it is, or it's Jim Crow, housing segregation, mass incarceration. And then you'll hear claims from folks who are on sort of more of the radical left side, black nationalist position, where they'll say, whoa, the problem, yeah, whatever, we know those people, right? The problem is the white liberals. It's the Karens, it's the pearl-clutching folks, it's the folks who, and you hear these sort of claims that, look, the real insidious problem is, racism of this kind versus that kind. And I wonder if you can kind of disaggregate it a little bit. Like, is it even useful? I'm showing my cards a little. I'm not sure that it's actually all that useful. I kind of want to say anti-Semitism's bad. It may not be, binary where it's like it's either it is or it isn't, and it's always clear what it is or it isn't. But getting into this game of which kind of anti-Semitism is worse, in some ways, is exactly the game that the haters want us to play, isn't it?
I don't know. I mean, I think that this idea that there is and I think we fall into this trap a little bit, that there is this group of anti-Semites out there. And when we talk about how anti-Semitism is the same or different than other forms of racism, there are two sort of models, one of which is this idea that anti-Semitism is like a virus. It's been around time immemorial. It goes away and it comes roaring back. And in fact, there's this whole line of thought, right, that the fact that the systemic anti-Semitism went away in the 60s, and then you see 70s, 80s, into the 90s, 2000s, and now that this animus toward Israel has emerged, that must be another manifestation of anti-Semitism, because there's no way that it just dissipated in the United States. It must have morphed into something else. And also that for that reason, it's categorically different than other forms of bigotry. There used to be anti-Italian bias, anti-Irish bias. That's just dissipated. It's not coming back in a new form. And the other framework is that anti-Semitism is similar to other forms of racism and discrimination, which is that people, there's in-group, out-group hostility. People have stereotypes about certain groups. Over time, through education and exposure, we know, for example, that if somebody knows a Jewish person, they're less likely to hold anti-Semitic beliefs. So the more that Jews get around and the more diversity we have, the more anti-Semitism will go away. So are there anti-Semites out there who were glad to see Jews debating the nuances of anti-Semitism as opposed to coming after them? I suppose those people probably exist. But I think that, the far right, far left thing is interesting, because I think that for people who want to sort of draw a direct parallel between neo-Nazis and college student protesters, I think that student protesters are much more reachable. They may stray into anti-Semitism in certain instances, but for the most part, and if you poll them, there's a lot of good data on this, they don't express animosity toward Jews by and large. So that means that if they're doing something that is inadvertently expressing animus or alienating Jews or making them uncomfortable, there's probably a lot more potential to have some kind of constructive education or work or dialogue there that's probably not there for the person who's marching down, the mall in DC waving a swastika flag. And so I do think that the distinctions are really important. And the other thing I would say is, if a Democratic administration got in there and said, we are going to strip federal funding from any college or university that does not implement a affirmative action agenda that says, 50% of the student body has to be African American, then I think it would be important to get into the nuances of what is or isn't racism. So I think, the sort of what we're seeing on the policy level and actually play out in the real world makes this a lot higher stakes than it might be otherwise.
So let's talk about then this that you're hinting at. This idea of anti-Semitism as a pretext. The Trump administration is certainly using it in that way for deporting people, for withholding hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding from universities. Given this, how do you help your readers distinguish between actual anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism that's kind of dressed up masquerading as anti-Semitism. Like, it's like anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, I try to just ground the reporting and the facts of what actually happened, which is relatively rare. And I've had people say things to me sort of reflexively, like, well, I think that the crackdown on the protests has been a little overblown, but obviously, when those kids were assaulted, in the dining hall at Columbia for wearing, yarmulkes, that's anti-Semitism. And I'm like, followed this pretty closely. So I go and I look up, students assault. No, there were not students assaulted in the dining hall at Columbia. There was an incident, you can sort of figure out what happened. And in that case, it was an incident where someone walked up to somebody wearing a yarmulke and said, F Jews, and was suspended by the university. And so I think just explaining what is actually going on is helpful. And similarly, right, with Mahmoud Khalil, it was like, okay, what are the actual allegations? What is he on the record as having said? Because a lot of people, there was this knee-jerk sort of, again, like, well, of course I don't agree with his views. And I was like, what are his views? Let's go see what has he said, what hasn't he said, what has he been affiliated with, and lay that all out for readers so that they can see. Because I think often we just stop at that first, like, well, anti-Semitic protests, someone was involved in it, and that's the end of it. So yeah, I mean, I would say that's the best thing that we can do for our readers, and then let them make up their own minds about whether they think something is, because I genuinely am not here to tell anyone what is or isn't anti-Semitic so much as I am trying to say, here's what is being described as anti-Semitic, here's the definition they're using, maybe you ask some questions about what makes it that way or not, put that in the story and let people, see.
Yeah. Let's talk about what happened to Josh Shapiro. So there's this attack in Harrisburg after Passover Seder. The Times reporting said that this man, Cody Balmer, identified himself in a 911 call and said that Governor Shapiro, quote, I'm taking this from the Times, needs to know that he will not take part in his plans for what he wants to do to the Palestinian people, right? So he talked about wanting to, hurt him, kill him with a hammer. Obviously, he firebombed, the governor's mansion where his family was sleeping. So he was clearly willing to do violence. It was interesting. Governor Shapiro's piece this week, his op-ed actually, he was not willing to take a position that this was an anti-Semitic attack. He said, ultimately, prosecutors will determine what motivated this act of violence, and we trust them to do their important work. And I guess the question I want to ask is, he may have politically expedient reasons to not make that characterization. I can't get inside his head to know what he's thinking, what he actually believes about what happened, but it seems to me, sort of looking at this, that there's a fair amount of evidence that this was an anti-Semitic attack, right? And I also feel it's hard to disaggregate that from the rhetoric that was coming from certain circles during the presidential campaign, especially when he was being considered as a vice presidential candidate, the labeling of him as Genocide Josh, when he held virtually identical positions on sort of America-Israel policy to other contenders, and they were not given that kind of epithet. And so what is the point at which reporting for a Jewish media outlet, it's reasonable to make characterizations of an attack on a Jewish governor who's a very sort of publicly Jewish governor and Jewish politician on the eve of Passover at a time of year when traditionally Jews have been targeted with the worst kind of most grotesque types of violence, passion plays and things like this. Is there a point at which we can say this really tracks as anti-Semitic or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think I try to take a similar tact with describing something as racist, which is if the perpetrator says, I'm committing this violence because this person is Jewish and I don't like Jews, right? That's anti-Semitic. And similarly, if they were to say, well, I don't like minorities, so I'm gonna, and we've seen this with some of the mass shootings in Buffalo and in El Paso, or if you're committing an act of violence while wearing a swastika T-shirt or something like that. Short of that, I mean, I think it's similarly, we have an opinion section and we ran a bunch of columns on this, but from the news reporting perspective, I don't think it's generally incumbent or responsible to make those sort of assertions, in part because, as Governor Shapiro mentioned in the op-ed, all the evidence is not out. We don't know the exact details. There have been incidents where, and there'll be things like vandalism at a high school. Somebody draws a swastika on the Jewish principal's door, and you think, okay, well, that's like a Nazi thing. They're like targeting them for being anti-Semitic, and it turns out, well, really the kid was trying to accuse the principal of being a Nazi for, I don't know, the dress code or something like that. And it's like, okay, well, it's offensive and probably a good learning lesson that you shouldn't do that to anyone's door, to a Jewish principal's door. But point being, it's dangerous when you're in the business of reporting information to jump to those assertions. But I think there's been a lot of really good analysis, some of which you may have read. I think The Atlantic had a piece about that connection from holding Governor Shapiro to a double standard to fueling anti-Israel violence toward him, whether or not it was anti-Semitic. But yeah, not so much in the news pages.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really challenging is it feels like a double standard. And part of this is we're sort of coming out of an era where there was a greater appreciation to noticing and naming oppression, targeting of, oppressed minorities, of women, right? So whether it's the Me Too movement and to say, like, we need to move beyond the tendency to sort of lean on the legal system and say, oh, we'll let when we know that, victims of rape, sexual assault, that there's underreporting. Part of the reason there's underreporting is because it's hard to be believed, because it's hard to prove in court. And so it becomes this sort of vicious cycle. And so the Me Too movement really challenged a generation to say, maybe we need to do a better job of listening to women and, not simply locking people up because of claims they make, but at least, making assumptions that they're probably telling the truth, or they're more likely to tell the truth if they're willing to come forward with that. And same thing is true of some of the ways we've been talking about, racism against Black and brown people. And I think there's a sense of like, right, but what about us? When it comes to Jews, then the tendency is, we always have to we have to sort of contort ourselves in order to say, well, have we considered mental illness? Have we considered, all of these different angles before we're willing to name something which just kind of walks and talks like a duck? And I'm not suggesting that the kind of journalism side of the forward ought to do that. I think you're right. I'd rather read that in the opinion side. But I'm curious how you grapple with this as a Jew and as a Jew working for a Jewish publication.
Yeah, so there's a long-standing difficulty that the left has had in understanding and addressing anti-Semitism that goes back unrelated to Israel. I mean, there's a long history on the sort of the socialist left of, blaming bankers, and then Jews become a scapegoat for complaints about the financial system or whatever else. And then this idea right in the United States where we see things kind of through a literal color prism, if you will, that of course there are Jews of all different races and ethnicities, but the majority of American Jews, vast majority, are white. And well, white people, and then especially, if you're dealing in stereotypes, and there's obviously some data to back this up, affluent white people, you can't, anti-Semitism, whatever, of course the Nazis were bad, but that's, you can't be experiencing oppression or discrimination. And that's been something that, has been a problem for a very long time. And that includes traditional anti-Semitism of just like, depicting, and there was some of this with Occupy Wall Street, right, where you had posters that were depicting bankers as stereotypical Jewish features, that kind of thing. Now, part of the issue, I think, and one of the challenges that I do face is claims of anti-Semitism have become so widespread toward critics of Israel that it has started to be understood sometimes as a point of pride that if you're being accused of anti-Semitism by one of these, especially the more right-wing to the right of the ADL and all these others, StopAntisemitism.org, Canary Mission, Beitar USA, which was sending lists of foreign students to the Trump administration, that's a badge of honor, right? That's good. It means you're doing something right. And there have been a lot of, I don't know if people, do people know Miss Rachel, the YouTube, basically the most popular YouTube channel creator for young children who like sing songs. And I don't know, I do not have a young child, but she was, recently tagged by Stop Anti-Semitism as, raising money for Hamas or something because she had raised money for Palestinian children in Gaza. And so I think the idea becomes when the claims are so widespread, it is then very hard to get people to take them seriously without doing exactly what you're talking about of trying to, well, I have to explain myself and this and that. And I think that happens for both legitimate cases, that spills over into like, no, this is bona fide real anti-Semitism. Now I have to explain this to you. And it's like, if you're a layman, you're like, well, yeah, but they just told me that Miss Rachel was anti-Semitic. So what's going on here? So I think that is a big challenge. And I don't know, our audience is overwhelmingly Jewish. So I think it's a little bit less of a challenge for us at the Forward. But in general with the media, it's like, I think they have a very difficult time parsing what is and isn't anti-Semitic, how to communicate things, how to explain the data that they're using. And I think it has a very detrimental impact on the ability to fight anti-Semitism when people start thinking, it almost feels like a boy who cried wolf thing. And I think Jews suffer for it.
I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Tell us about Project Esther. And what is it? How do you think we Jews should feel about it? What does this effort by the Heritage Foundation teach us, not just about the nature of anti-Semitism, but also anti-Semitism maybe as a tool of some kind? Yeah,
so Project Esther was created by the Heritage Foundation, which also created Project 2025. It came out about a month before the presidential election, and it was the Heritage Foundation's basically plan, recommendation to Trump on how to fight anti-Semitism if he were elected, and it was created in conjunction with a couple of Jewish groups. It's a little bit unclear. None really wanted to take credit for participating. They claimed that many more had participated, but it included the America First Policy Institute, which is Stephen Miller's think tank and was sort of described as a White House in waiting. And it described basically a Hamas support network in the United States that included some Jewish organizations, progressive foundations like the Tides Foundation, and it called for using RICO, the sort of anti-mafia statute, to go after anti-Israel protesters. It called for deportations. It called for a crackdown on colleges and universities. And I think Politico just had a piece that came out that said that something like 25 of the 28 recommendations have been acted on by the Trump administration. And one of the interesting things about it was sort of the lack of Jewish involvement. It was created by a team at the Heritage Foundation that did not, to my knowledge, really include any Jews. And the guy who was in charge of it, James Carafano, was asked, why it didn't mention anything about the far right. Even if you're focusing on the far left, typically people say, well, of course the far right is also bad. He said, well, white supremacists aren't part of the conservative movements. They're not my problem. Like, why would I be dealing with white supremacists? Of course, I mean, by that logic, why would you be dealing with the far left, who is also not part of the conservative movement? But they just had no interest in it. And we got some internal leaked documents from the Heritage Foundation that showed their understanding of anti-Semitism that literally had George Soros and J.B. Pritzker, the Jewish governor of Illinois, at the top of a pyramid. And downstream from the pyramid was anti-Semitism and sort of the destruction of, you could think of it as sort of white America. And when you dig around into the background of some of the policy documents America First Policy Institute put out, for example, they talk about anti-Semitism as, on the left, the way it's often talked about is it's a canary in the coal mine for a crackdown on other minorities, that, a society that tolerates anti-Semitism is going to tolerate violence and discrimination toward other minorities. They had an inverse image of that, which was anti-Semitism as a precursor to the persecution of Christian Americans. And the Trump administration, I think, has carried out that view. They created an anti-Semitism task force that is led by a non-Jewish civil rights attorney who was good family friends with O.J. Simpson and sort of was first in the news for raising money for his Legal Defense Fund and was most recently retweeting a white supremacist on Twitter who was joking about how Trump's allowed to revoke anyone's Jew card, reference to calling Chuck Schumer a Palestinian. That's the head of Trump's anti-Semitism task force. It's an interagency task force. So it has Justice Department, Health and Human Services, et cetera. And they're all like lower level officials. So he's like the deputy head of the Civil Rights Division, something like that. Around the same time that he created the anti-Semitism task force, and of course that's what we're hearing about in the news, he also created an anti-Christian bias task force, and that is led by cabinet level secretaries. So the head of that is the Attorney General. And so, the administration is talking about and acting on anti-Semitism in certain respects, but they've also sort of signaled in a variety of ways that their primary concern is the persecution of generally, I think, white evangelical Christians, similar to the crackdown on DEI, for example. And Project Esther, it's a little bit hard to tell, and I've been careful in my reporting because, of course, the Heritage Foundation would love to take credit and say, look, they're just following our plan. I think as much as anything, it was a crystallization of a lot of threads that were already existing in terms of how the right tries to fight anti-Semitism, but it came together in an interesting way there, and we're seeing it play out a bit in the policy.
Let's take some questions from the audience.
Thank you. I was very taken with your opening remarks talking about the trend, why we're seeing anti-Semitism as a problem, even though it was a much bigger problem in earlier times. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say that I appreciated the way you analyzed it, because I'm in a breakfast club with some guys. One of the guys was born in Germany in 1924 and came here in the 1930s. His father got a job with McCormick Spice Company, and when they found out he was Jewish, they fired him. And we're not seeing that. So I just thought your analysis about what we're seeing is based on where the trend is as upward as opposed to the trend being downward. So I appreciated that very much.
Sure. Can I know it wasn't a question,
Please,
but
sure,
can I?
yeah.
One thing that I like to talk about when I do like a talk as opposed to just a sort of Q&A is about the choices that American Jews have made over time and how to respond to anti-Semitism. Because I think that we're at a moment where we are making particular choices, and they're changing and fluid and evolving, about how we understand and choose to act on anti-Semitism. And if you go back, throughout American history, there have been choices made. When Henry Ford was publishing, that would be like, you could see some parallels in many ways with Elon Musk, but he was distributing to every Ford dealership in the country, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an anti-Semitic newspaper. And there was a big debate in the Jewish community. Do we say anything? Do we not? And that was less political. That was more about sensibility. Do we want to pick a fight? Jews felt a lot more vulnerable in the 1920s, of course, than we do today. But in the 50s and 60s, there was a big thing around. There were, I believe, 13 synagogues bombed in the southern United States over about 10 years in the late 50s and early 60s. And you would think today, a synagogue getting bombed would be, both front page news and also incredibly sort of terrifying. And there was a big sense in the leadership of the Jewish community that these were not anti-Semitic attacks because they were only bombing the synagogues that supported the civil rights movement. So this was political violence. And similarly, when there were attacks on communist Jews, bona fide communist Jews, there was a sense that really, Jews shouldn't go around making us all look bad by joining the Communist Party. So it's not anti-Semitism, the problem is that they're communist. And so, I say that only to point out that not only have the trend lines changed and what's objectively happening changed, but the fights that we're interested in picking have changed. And I think there's often a sense, you mentioned, right, anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism, let's just fight it. But it's actually, an ongoing sort of negotiation and shifting sense of what is actually a threat to us, where we pick our battles. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's not only that the objective trend line is changing, but it's just the choices that we're making are different now than they have been in the past. Right,
but you're not making the claim that it was I understand the choice they're making, they're feeling vulnerable, but I think with the perspective of history, we can look back and saying bombing synagogues is anti-Semitic, right? That's not political violence.
Yeah, no,
just like the guy who murdered 11 people in Pittsburgh, that wasn't political violence because of their position on immigration. Even
Right,
though
no,
that
could
was
you
his
imagine
claim.
if that's, yeah,
Right, okay.
yeah. No, I think history can be very instructive, but the point is just that the way that the community understands these things does evolve. And I think the communist thing is more interesting, right? It's sort of like, okay, well, if you're a prominent Jewish communist, are you making the community look bad by misrepresenting what Jews stand for and inviting invective on Jews who are not communists? Or are you being unfairly targeted because you are Jewish and we should defend you? And that's like it was a real question at the time. I don't know exactly what history would validate there. But yeah, I think we've made lots of mistakes throughout history.
I think Judith Chagrin has a mic. Yeah.
So hopefully I'll collect my thoughts. I am concerned that, with all due respect, you're minimizing the extent of anti-Semitism, which I usually call Jew hate, because there's too many times when I've been told, oh, anti-Semitism, that's all people who are, but anyhow. That I'm a social worker. First of all, I'm a social worker, a profession that's committed to respect for others without regard to culture, religion, ethnic, sex, race, whatever. And I have to tell you that the alarming rise in anti-Semitism in my profession has been alarming, and I can't minimize it. If I had an hour, I could give you all the examples. Again, a profession committed, and we're very liberal, committed to respecting others and believing that minorities are experts on themselves. And as a Jew, my expertise in my own Jewishness and Jew hate is questioned in a way that no other minority would be questioned. I'm in a WhatsApp group with professors from schools of, sorry, I get very emotional, professors of schools of social work from across the country. They would humbly disagree that their students are that educable about Jew hate, especially the professors from Columbia. And I'm not sure what point I'm getting to. Oh, the last thing I would just say is anti-Semitism never went away. It's like any other minority hate, that it bubbles just beneath the surface. It doesn't mean people are aware of it, just as racism against black people. It's like we're all recovering racists. We have to stay conscious and aware of our bias. Jew hate never went away. It just went under the surface until 10/7, when it was all given new air. And I see far more of it on the left than I do on the right. And I find it very alarming, and I think that downplaying it is a real mistake.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that Jews are facing, and it was sort of when my friend was talking about being sort of like shut down by all these women because he wouldn't denounce Zionism, I was like, what's that about? Why is there this litmus test being applied? And I think it's applied in a lot of progressive and leftist spaces, and often does spill over into sort of diffuse animosity toward Jews, where you try to say, well, actually, as a Jew, here's what I understand anti-Semitism to be, and it's like, well, you just support genocide, or you're just supporting a Nazi state. I think the other reason we see a lot more of it on the left than the right is because most Jews are of the left much more than they are of the right. And, if there were, if you look at something like abortion or gay marriage or these other issues, you don't have a lot of people who want to be part of progressive liberal spaces who simultaneously, hate affirmative action, don't want there to be gay rights, don't want abortion right, all of that sort of stuff. Those people are on the right, but Jews aren't. And so we've definitely seen, especially in spaces that tend to be more leftist, like social work, like college campuses, Jews being, like abortion advocacy organizations, Jews being pushed out of these spaces. And I think that's what I was saying at the top about, I think at the end of the day, there is a lack of recognition of the sort of full humanity of American Jews. That like, why is this person who I've worked alongside with in coalition, political coalitions, at this advocacy nonprofit for years, isn't it strange that I now believe that they're like a genocidaire and a white supremacist? And might I pause and try to learn a little bit about where they're coming from and give some grace? And I think the lack of willingness to do that is connected to anti-Semitism, and certainly the impact is anti-Semitic, and it's very disconcerting. And I think the tragic thing is that I think it's much worse. I mean, this is just my editorializing. I think it's worse for the left in many respects, because if the net result is that Jews get pushed out of leftist spaces, they're already relatively marginal. You know, it's not like the world of social work, for example, is a terribly well-resourced world. People are going into it to make money. They're going into it to help disadvantaged people. So if you kick all the Jews out of that space, who suffers there? Absolutely Jews. It's bad for Jews, but it's really tragic, I think, for the communities that are doing this. So yeah, it's a real phenomenon. I don't mean to suggest otherwise.
Who is next over here? Jonathan, and then Mark. Yeah.
So I have a question about what's been going on in college campuses, and your depiction of, trying to parse out when people are, what they're saying, is it anti-Zionist or it's anti-Semitic, and how do you really figure out what is really behind all that? And we only know what we're reading in the media, but it does seem to me that leadership in a lot of the major universities are saying that there's an anti-Semitic problem on their campuses, and they're trying to deal with it. Now, I don't know if this is just like a knee-jerk reaction to pressure they're getting from the Trump administration, or if in fact they really recognize that there's a problem on their campus and they need to address it. And so for example, at Columbia, based on things that I've read, with the faculty, for example, the humanities faculty on campus tend to be more supportive of the anti-Zionist trend, whereas the science faculty, the medical faculty, people who are sort of not on the main 116th Street campus, they feel differently. And so people we know who are in academia say there is this sort of dichotomy between the humanities faculty and the people who are working in research and medicine. And the other sort of question I have about higher education is that, so it seems pretty obvious to me that, Trump is using this as like this issue of anti-Semitism on campuses as a tool to go after higher education and elite higher education. And I'm really concerned about the ultimate backlash from that, because if universities are really eviscerated, at some point people are going to say, this is all done in the name of Jews. So I just wonder what your thoughts are about those things.
Yeah, I mean, starting with the last piece, I think that's sort of what you were asking about. Like, Jews are already in a position and have been in a position for a long time of having to explain that, like, yes, I may be white, but also I can experience discrimination, and anti-Semitism is real, and sometimes it doesn't mean that I'm getting fired from my job, but if you believe that the Jewish bankers are to blame for, why you can't afford rent, that is anti-Semitic. And then you layer on top of that the fact that it is being used as, a pretext, or maybe it's addressing a real problem, but of course you have Trump saying you're not allowed to do any diversity initiatives on your campus except for protecting Jews. And yeah, it's kind of hanging out Jews to dry in a sort of scary way. I think in terms of what we're seeing on college campuses, and yes, I think what you're describing is correct. The humanities, you have more progressive faculty in the humanities, more activist professors who are not doing, the same type of academic research. That's a real phenomenon. We haven't had another, you try to think of other student protest movements, and typically you're not protesting people who are on your campus. And please excuse the analogy, because this is not the point. I'm not trying to compare Israel to apartheid South Africa, but if you look at the anti-South African apartheid movement on college campuses, it was also very vitriolic, involved strikes and shutdowns and occupying administrative buildings. There were not a significant Afrikaner student body on these college campuses to direct your animus toward. There was not a South Africa house that you could go picket or boycott, so you didn't have to figure out how can you have a protest movement without suppressing their free speech that doesn't result in part of the student body feeling ostracized or targeted or discriminated against. And so I really don't think that there's a playbook for universities to follow in addressing this. And I think they're seeing what you described, right? That a big part of the Jewish student body is feeling uncomfortable and alienated. But I can tell you, having reported from a number of campuses over the past, before October 7th too, you really can't, throw a stone in one of these encampments and not hit a Jewish student. I mean, there's huge anti-Zionist Jewish student representation. Something like 25 to 30% of young Jews, like under the age of 24, think that Israel, pre-October 7th, believed that Israel was an apartheid state that was committing genocide. So that's like a third of, on college campuses, like a third of the Jewish students are sympathetic to the protest movement, which I think makes it even more complicated. I think you sort of have a third there. You might have half that are aligned with Hillel, and then you have 10 to 20% that are like, oh my gosh, this is such a terrible, leave me alone. I don't want to have to deal with this. I don't want to pick a side. Yeah, but it's very fraught.
Mark.
I can hear you, but...
Maybe I should use yours.
I think it's working now. Go ahead.
Okay. So I was actually thinking what Jonathan was thinking, so I'll ask the follow-up question. If you accept that the Trump administration's use of anti-Semitism is actually a tool to batter the universities, to curtail free speech, which as someone who works at a university that is experiencing this right now, that's what it feels like. Could you speculate as to why the large, important Jewish organizations in this country have yet to acknowledge this in a way that is very public and vocal?
Yeah, I mean, there was just a letter that the Reform and Conservative movements both signed on to that I think was taking that position. And then the Jewish Federations of North America network came out and basically told their local affiliates not to sign on to this letter and to support what the Trump administration is doing. If folks have seen Deborah Lipstad's latest comments, Biden's anti-Semitism envoy, renowned Holocaust scholar, people were sort of mocking this interview that she did with the New Yorker. But you can see her thinking in real time, and she says out loud, well, look, I know as a scholar of anti-Semitism that attacks on democracy, that attacks on free speech are the biggest threat to Jews, and that's really bad, and I don't really know if Trump cares about fighting anti-Semitism, and I didn't like the Nazi salute from Elon. But universities brought this upon themselves. They wouldn't crack down on the protests, and Jewish students were unsafe, and basically Biden, while she was there, wouldn't do anything about it. So it is what it is. And I think that's the position. I mean, it's a tricky thing, because I think a lot of times Jewish organizations, any advocacy organization, you're trying to push the envelope a little bit. You're saying, we want to move the needle, but we're not going to ask for the needle to move 10%. We're going to ask for it to move 50% and hope that we get 5%. And so in some sense, Trump is doing what these organizations had been asking the federal government to do for since October 7th. And I think they understood that the Biden administration was not going to go all the way there. So they were agitating, it's typical lobbying. And now you get him in saying, well, this is what you're asking for us. All right, we're deporting people, we're cutting all their funding. And I think these organizations are caught with a little bit of well, I guess we didn't emphasize that we wanted, and you see this in the statements from ADL and AJC, we like what you're saying, but we're worried that you're not including due process in what you're saying. And at the same time, they frankly don't have a seat at the table because the Trump administration is relying on much more conservative Jewish organizations like Beitar, which barely, it has a long history, but in its current form, barely existed in the United States 12 months ago, and now they have a seat at the table to tell them who to deport. So I think they're in a very tricky position. I also think that, throughout reporting on this, there are, the folks who are funding a lot of the leading Jewish organizations are more conservative than the average American Jew, and I think that they're, okay with a more aggressive approach. They're less concerned with protecting, elite colleges and universities or protecting sort of liberal conceptions of free speech. And so that's part of the constituency that these advocacy groups are responding to. But, it's also early days. It's been, a few months. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in the months and years to come.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yes, Mordechai.
So I was very interested in the way you nuanced the situation on college campuses and the difficulties. But do you have a suggestion for how the campuses should be playing this? And is there a way, given your experience in analyzing this, to actually address some of these issues? And how do you think they should respond?
Yeah, I'm very glad not to be a college administrator right now. And no, I don't have a clear answer. I think it's very interesting to see that there are college campuses where things have not blown up and why that is. And Columbia and Harvard, or the Ivy Leagues, it's tough because they've been a target. It's like they're a lightning rod, and they have been for decades in the culture wars. I did some reporting from Elon University in North Carolina, which is this little liberal arts college that's become kind of a magnet for a lot of Jewish students. And, it's not a very activist campus. That was one thing that people pointed out. But that aside, they told this story about how they invited, I think the humanities professors, invited the head of Al-Haq, which is a Palestinian human rights organization, and 20 years ago accused Israel of apartheid in a pretty strident group. The leader came to speak to the student body and gave apparently a relatively inflammatory speech and kind of went off script. And there were a lot of Jewish students that were unhappy about that. And the sort of conclusion was that the school facilitated that night after the talk. They had 5 Jewish students who sort of complained from Hillel come and have dinner with the guy from Al-Haq, and they could talk about it, and they could talk with the president, and that fit into this sort of ethos at the school that like they have tables in the dining area where you can come and sit at this table and talk about the war in Gaza if you want to, or talk about anti-Semitism. Just anyone can show up and talk, and there's a dean there. The president of the university is, playing ping pong with people in the student commons. And so I think they try to break down the adversarial nature of a lot of this. And that seems like a good strategy to me. But I think if anyone had figured out how to solve it, they'd be in very high demand right now.
Anyone else? Yeah. Kind of final question up here.
I'm interested in your thoughts. I was intrigued by what you said about Mahmoud Khalil. And, oh, sure. I mean, I've been trying to sort out for myself, and I read mainly liberal media, how do you figure out what the truth is? Like, I've been trying to sort out, with respect to Mr. Khalil, for example, what exactly he said. Is it really anti-Semitic? I understand that as a permanent legal resident, he doesn't necessarily have all of the same rights that a U.S. citizen would have, but he certainly does have First Amendment and due process rights. So for people who want to sort of understand what's actually happening and being said, it's hard to rely on, media is, for the most part, slanted in one way or another. So do you have any suggestions for how to get at the facts as opposed to the editorial slant of the particular publication? And if you're willing to share your thoughts, what do you think about Mr. Khalil? I mean, if you might have more information about, that situation, I'd be curious to know what you think.
Yeah, I plug for reading the foreword. I think we're a good source of information. I think that really just trying to track down the facts, you don't see as much. I mean, there's some of this on fringe websites, a lot of this on social media. But when you get to an article, typically you can still suss out attribution, right? So if there's a quote, if it's quoting him as having said something, where? And is it quoting him, or is it, a lot of this is he was a leader of, a negotiator for the protesters. There were protests. There was a relatively recent protest prior to his arrest where somebody was handing out, or there was on a table, like brochures from the Hamas media office celebrating, October 7th. So are they quoting those pamphlets and saying, well, he must believe the same thing, or is it a direct quote from him? He's interesting. I mean, he has a very thin, as sort of a test case, he was an odd person to pick because he has a very thin, he doesn't have a social media account where he was posting stuff. He was in negotiations behind closed doors. He was in a documentary where he said, the sort of standard thing that you hear people say in the protest movement, which is, of course we abhor anti-Semitism, the liberation of the Palestinians and Jews go hand in hand, which, you could say is sort of pablum, but that's what he's on record as having said. So there's not a whole lot on him other than that he was involved in these protests, and then you lump everything in the protests together. And I think that one thing that the protest movement has had a really hard time doing, if you look at a group like Students for Justice in Palestine, which I wrote a long history of, they have there is no Students for Justice in Palestine in terms of an organization with a leadership structure. There's a national steering committee that is completely anonymous, that it is very difficult to interview anyone from, and that puts out does not really put out public communications. And I was talking to, there are Jewish members on the steering committee, and I was talking to them about National Students for Justice in Palestine put out a toolkit after October 7th that was celebratory of the attack. And they were kind of like, yeah, I don't know. I really didn't feel like that comfortable with it, but I don't really want to be quoted as saying that. And so when you have nobody who's willing to, and then people are getting doxxed. I understand why some of them are shielding their identity. You can't even get someone's name to interview at a protest. So there's nobody to sort of take ownership and say, this is what the movement stands for. This is what we don't stand for. And so then we see this just sort of like all mashed together into one thing. And these people, it's like, well, you were seen at a protest one time, and now we're going to kick you out of the country. It's very hard to suss out. So yeah, but that's kind of what we know about Mahmoud Halil.
Great.
Can I just follow one question on that, which is, I thought he had an Israeli-American friend he was actually working with, and they were both focused on trying to get the Palestinians and Jews together, and both were in favor of a two-state solution.
Khalil?
I don't think, I hadn't seen that specific thing. The protest movements are certainly not in favor of a two-state solution. I guess my point about the how no one's really speaking for the movement is within the movement, you have a pretty broad spectrum of people who are like anti-war, liberal Zionist friendly to like hardcore, all Israelis are evil. And what I've heard from people who did know him is that the position of being a negotiator is a more moderate position, that whatever your personal beliefs, you're trying to like bring the university together with the protesters, and it's a tricky dance. I hadn't seen that specific thing, but yeah, there's a lot of like, things that are a little tricky to understand from the outside.
So anyone who shows up between Pesach and Shavuot wearing dreidel socks is okay in my book. And so please join me in thanking Arno Rosenfeld for his time this evening.
Thanks so much for having me.
Just given that we're gathering on Yom HaShoah, I really wanted to be attentive to the gravity and seriousness of the day and the occasion. So we've had a pretty high-level intellectual conversation, tried to address the really thorny topic of anti-Semitism, obviously relevant to Yom HaShoah. But with your permission, I want to, just as we started with these candles, as someone who's a descendant of a Holocaust survivor and had an aunt who was in Theresienstadt and survived, I feel really sort of called to the moment as well. And so I thought it would be appropriate to just close with some piece of music, and perhaps we could have another discussion another time about where Chana Senesh sort of fits into the complexity of anti-Semitism, Hungarian Jewish woman who makes Aliyah to Palestine, who is parachuted by the British military into Yugoslavia and is caught at the Hungarian border, tortured, and then ultimately executed by firing squad, and yet left behind this really beautiful body of poetry. And so one of the pieces that I think of when I think of Yom HaShoah is this piece, Eli, Eli, which has nothing to do with hate and nothing to do with anti-Semitism and everything to do with a young woman looking at a beautiful world and trying to capture it in a few lines of verse. A life that was snuffed out, shouldn't have been, and what she and others might have given to the world, let alone the 6 million people who were exterminated and the millions upon millions of descendants that might have come from them, no longer possible because of the actions of the Nazis. So I hope you'll join me in singing this tune, if you know it, as we conclude tonight. Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam, hacho v'hayam, rishru shel hamayim, berak hashamayim, tfilat ha'adam, hacho v'hayam, hacho v'hayam, rishru shel hamayim, shel hamayim, Barak hashamayim, Barak hashamayim, Tfilat ha'adam, Tfilat ha'adam. O Lord my God, O Lord my God, I pray that these things never end. I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the crash of the heavens. Humanity's prayer, humanity's prayer. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, humanity's prayer. Erev Tov, everybody. Have a good night. Thanks again. Thank you. I appreciate it.